Hey there, what are you doing?
Just looking at birds.
Welcome. I'm your host, Chris. Join me as I interview avid birders to learn more about birds, birding, and those who love both. Today, my guest is Karen Vandergrift. With a desire to learn more about natural history, Karen pursued training as a Master Naturalist in both California and Arizona, with experience as a docent on Alcatraz Island and more recently at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. Karen now leads talks as a Sabino Canyon volunteer naturalist and leads birding field trips for the Tucson Audubon Society. It's good to have you on today.
Thank you. Thanks. It's really fun to be here.
For someone living in Arizona, you've taken an interesting path into birding. When did you first take an interest in birding?
Well, I did it a little differently than most people in North America. I started birding in South America. About 20 years ago, my husband and I bought a ranch in Uruguay. And when we were first there, I noticed the southern lapwing, which is a member of the plover family. And it is such a beautiful, strange-looking bird. I fell in love with it and decided to pursue the birds around our ranch. And just sitting out on the terrace at night with a glass of wine and relaxing, all the birds came to me, Chris. And so it was important to me to start identifying them so that I could then turn around and explain to the guests who came to visit me what those birds were.
Sure.
So it was kind of entry level into guiding, if you will, because my guests wanted to know.
Yeah.
So about 13 years later, when I moved back to San Francisco more or less full time, I had been running the ranch as a hotel, and I closed that portion of it. I decided to get into birding full time.
When you think back further, what's your earliest memory of a bird?
Well, that's going way back, but in the early 70s as a kid, my father was a pilot in the Navy, and we were stationed in Hawaii. And I remember as a young elementary school student, I was probably in the first grade, the teacher teaching us about the Hawaiian goose, which we call the nene. And by 1958 or something, the entire world population of the Hawaiian goose, which is indigenous to the Hawaiian Islands, was down to about 30 individuals, not 30 pairs, but 30 individuals. So it was a very, very important bird. It's the Hawaiian state bird. And it was very important to the native Hawaiians to increase the population again. So they taught the kids, they taught us about that goose and brought us into one of the preserves to show us what that goose was. It looks very much like a small Canada goose. And in fact, they're somewhat closely related. But the populations are growing again. They're up to several thousand birds. They began a captive breeding program in, of all places, Great Britain. And so they've been introducing over the past several decades those birds back to the Hawaiian Islands. But it is still vulnerable, still threatened, and just a beautiful little goose.
When you bird today, what do you enjoy most about it?
The sounds. Birding for me is almost a meditative quality. It has a meditative quality to it. And when I first began birding, I did it alone for the most part in South America sitting. And now with the craziness of this modern world, and as we go faster and faster, birding is very meditative for me. I do enjoy sharing birds with the public, but my biggest joy is just being out in nature, as many people say, listening, soaking it in, and relaxing, calming, and slowing down.
That's reasonable. When you think of these birding experiences you've had, what is a particularly memorable encounter with a bird that you've had?
When I first got back to San Francisco, as I mentioned, it was about 2013. I began working with the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory as a raptor bander. And we were trained in how to handle raptors without gloves because we were handling all different species, from red-tailed hawks down to kestrels. And I had had a lot of experience at that point handling larger, the red tails, the Cooper's hawks, but I hadn't yet had my first kestrel. Well, when I finally got one in hand, it was an experience. She was such a feisty little bird. And I don't know how she did it, but she could find the quick of my fingernails and peck right in there. Painful, painful, painful. So I have a lot of respect for our very small falcons because they are feisty, vicious little birds. I remember that very clearly to this day.
So as a raptor bander, can you tell some of us who may not know what that entails, what is the purpose of banding these birds?
So when you're banding birds in general, it's usually science-based information that the biologists are obtaining to learn about population levels, migration patterns, how populations are doing in any given region. And that the same is true for raptors. We typically, for the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory, banded in the fall, during the fall migration. The Marin headlands funnel raptors down through a very narrow area right around the Golden Gate.
Okay.
And so we would capture through nets. You can think of small mist nets for small birds like kestrels. And we had many different species, from the larger red tails, occasionally a ferruginous hawk, a broad-tailed hawk, very occasionally a peregrine falcon. Now remember, all these birds are very different sizes.
Sure.
So once they were in hand or in can, we would take all the measurements. We would take wingspans, wing chord measurements, culmen, which is beak. We would take tarsus. And all of this was very important, of course, to increase the data for all these species.
Sure.
But for example, with the tarsus measurements, that would then tell us what size band to put on. If you're just banding songbirds, for example, your bands are pretty consistent in size. But with something like a red tail, you're dealing with a much larger band than you would be dealing with for, say, a kestrel.
Yeah. And that brings with it some challenges, measuring these different birds for these different bands.
Indeed, because again, we did not wear gloves.
Yeah.
So we're handling these birds gloveless, and you have to be exceedingly careful, especially on something like a Cooper's hawk or a kestrel, where their tarsus are so thin, toothpick thin, and you live in fear that you're gonna harm these birds.
Yeah.
So we were very, very careful. Very intensive training went into this program.
I'm sure.
And it's still going on today. It's highly regarded. The Golden Gate Raptor Observatory has two branches. They have a banding branch, and they also have hawk watchers that are up on top of Hawk Hill, and they are literally counting every single raptor that flies through. It's a great organization.
Yeah, sounds like it. When you think of your next birding experience, are there any birds you're particularly interested in seeing next?
Who doesn't want to see the shoebill in Africa, Uganda or Sudan? I would love to see that bird. It is so charismatic. It is so weird and wonderful. And maybe this is a little bit of wishful thinking. My husband and I took a trip to South Africa a couple of years ago.
Okay.
So Africa is not on the immediate bucket list, but I do hope to get back and see that bird someday.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
When you think about our audience members, some of our audience are new to birding. What is a piece of advice you would share with them?
I've heard a lot of people talk over the years, and even specifically on your podcast, about the gestalt of the bird and the behavior and bill size, and all of that is super important. But if we're talking about a really new birder, I go back to basics. Think of the Merlin app as a good guide. What is the first thing Merlin asks you when you are out birding and you want to ID a bird? They want to know where you are and when you are.
Yeah.
And that's pretty critical, when you are because of the season and where you are for habitat.
Sure.
And then, of course, the size of the bird relative to other birds that you see. But right after that, Chris, what do they ask? They ask color, the main colors that you see. They don't ask you about beak size. They don't ask you about behavior until a little later.
That's true.
But they ask you about color. And we hear so much about don't rely on color. Well, that's great when you've become a more experienced birder. You've been out a couple of times.
Sure.
Color is critical. And also the ability to talk about color, because we use terminology in birding like rufous to name a bird or to describe a color, or plumbeous Same thing, to name or describe a color. And I think it might help new birders to learn those terms a little bit. I also think, and this is key for me, the number one thing I tell new birders is as often as you go out with a guide, go out at least as much by yourself. Because when you're with a guide and they see a bird, they may do nothing more than point out the bird and tell you what it is.
Yeah.
And then move on. But when you are out in the field and you see a new bird, you are with that bird, you're spending time with that bird, you're opening up your field guide, you're running through a lot of similar species, maybe you're listening to the bird. And by the time you've narrowed down what that bird is, maybe only to genus, but hopefully to species, you own that bird. That bird is yours and you're not going to forget it.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you're out and you're learning 5, 10, 15, 20 new birds a day, you don't remember them unless you found them yourself. So I think color is very important, and I don't disparage any new birder for learning color first. And I think going out and birding by yourself, it's challenging, and it can be extremely frustrating birding
not
by
knowing
yourself.
what's there, yeah.
But like I said, when you have that bird, it's yours.
I just want to come back to one of the words you mentioned, if you could. Give our listeners an easier definition to understand for rufous.
Rufous refers to red, rufous coming from the Latin iron, and actually plumbeous as well. Plumbeous comes, I think, a slightly different derivation, but plumbeous meaning lead. So some people almost say a purplish color, but a dark lead, dark gray color, and rufous could be a cinnamony color, but generally a rusty red color.
Okay. When you think of the word rufous, what's the first bird that pops into your head?
I think of the rufous-backed robin, which we get here very intermittently.
Yeah.
I think one has been seen fairly recently down in, maybe at Santa Gertrudis Lane, but in the Tubac area. What else do I think of? I think of rufous in terms of more of a descriptor when we talk about here we go, rufous-winged sparrow. Has that little rufous patch on its wing, or the rufous crowned sparrow. We often refer to crowns as being rufous. So rufous winged sparrow, rufous crowned sparrow are species which appear here.
And that's helpful for our listeners as they encounter that new term. Maybe those are a couple birds that they can start with to say, okay, that's what rufous looks like.
Come to Sabino Canyon and we will find a rufous winged and a rufous crowned sparrow.
There we go. Outside of field guides, apps, what is something you've purchased for less than $100 that has had the largest impact on your birding experience?
I swear by Birds of the World. It's a website. I think it's birdsoftheworld.org.
Yes.
It is published by Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And when I first got turned on to it, was just birds of North America. And you can type in any bird, either taxonomically or just colloquial name, and it is going to bring up an exhaustive account of that species. Everything from just a general description down to specific ID marks to habits, habitat, foraging, the food it eats, its breeding program, its courtship patterns, the nest, conservation issues. I mean, it is nearly exhaustive. And some of the most recent information that we have on species now worldwide. A lot of accounts are not as fleshed out because we're still learning a lot about many birds of the world. But especially for North American birds, if you see a bird and you ask yourself a question, where does this bird breed? I go directly to birdsoftheworld.org and get that information. There's also the Breeding Bird Atlas, for example, for Arizona. These books can be kind of expensive. They're still under $100, maybe $70, $75. But you can find a used copy for $30-ish. Birds of the World, an annual subscription is $42. And I can't live without it. Can't live without it. And especially if you get into public interpretation and you want to be able to flesh out that bird and tell people more about it than just where you find it and what the ID is. You can get into a lot more detail and some of the sexy little habits that bird might do that make it an individual.
So it sounds like that Birds of the World subscription gets you access to more recent research and then also a much broader span of information than you might get out of a typical birding guide or app.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's not only broad, it's deep. So a typical app will give you a kind of a broad-based approach to a bird. Maybe you get a little map, a little regional map of where the bird appears.
Yeah.
But Birds of the World goes into serious depth and detail. And I just think it's one of the greatest resources for any birder, not just a new birder, any birder.
When you spoke about the Breeding Bird Atlas, what is the draw or the use? Why would I pick up that book? So if I have a Birds of the World subscription, I have these other apps, why would I pick up the Breeding Bird Atlas?
Because what the Breeding Bird Atlas is going to do, for example, the Arizona issue, the Arizona edition, is going to tell you specifically where that bird breeds in Arizona.
Okay.
So it could be that breeding records have been found up in the White Mountains, but not in the Pinaleños, for example. Birds of the World is not going to give you that detail down to specific sites within a state or within a region.
Okay.
So for us, that's very helpful because when we're out and we see birds coming through migration, some of us may ask ourselves, well, is the purple martin nesting here? Birds of the World will tell you in general where the purple martins are nesting. It's mainly an East Coast bird. Okay. But yes, we do have a breeding population here in Tucson. Yeah. And the Breeding Bird Atlas, hopefully, if it's a recent enough edition, will give you that information about where specifically those birds are nesting.
Okay. Now let's move on to our bird segment, where my guests have a chance to share a bit about a bird of their choice. And for this episode, Karen has chosen the turkey vulture. Where are these vultures typically found?
Well, vultures appear on every continent on the planet except Australia and Antarctica. There are Old World vultures and New World vultures. The Old World vultures and the New World are not related to each other. Their resemblance comes down to convergent evolution, meaning that they fill similar ecological niches in their region. So in the case of the vulture, they are scavengers, they are carrion eaters, and they help clean up the environment. I love the turkey vulture because its name, Cathartes aura, refers to catharsis, which means to purify in Latin, and aura meaning golden. So the turkey vulture, a much unloved and misunderstood bird, its name is Golden Purifier. It's just a really spectacular, super, super beneficial bird that I'd like people to become more familiar with and appreciative of.
Oh. These birds, where do they usually nest?
Turkey vultures nest like California condors on bare rock. They don't build a nest on any bare surface. They have been found, if you can find a turkey vulture nest, because it's exceedingly difficult. They have been found in hollowed out tree trunks, but typically on rock ledges, but bare ground. They don't construct any kind of twig nest or branch nest. It's on the bare ground.
Okay. How large are their broods usually?
So a turkey vulture lays between 2 and 3 eggs. They will generally raise 2 chicks to adulthood. And the turkey vulture is our most widespread vulture, occurring from the southern portions of Canada all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. Some of the populations are semi-migratory, but many of them are stationary birds that stay in their region. Our turkey vulture is semi-migratory. You will notice in the wintertime, we have far, far fewer turkey vultures in the Tucson area, and you have to go a little further south into, you could go to Tubac maybe and see them, or further south into Mexico.
Okay. When we talk about their broods, their young, is there anything particularly different about their young ones?
So the turkey vulture, like many birds, hatches altricial young, as opposed to precocial.
And can you define those for us?
Yeah, altricial refers to a bird or anything that is sort of helpless at birth, needing nursing, needing care, as opposed to precocial. We get our term precocious for our very sassy children that are very mature for their age. Precocial means that they are able to care for themselves at birth. So the turkey vulture is altricial, featherless, hairless, generally blind. They also, interestingly, as juvenile birds, maintain a black head. And it's not until they are adults that they get that characteristic red head. And this can confuse people because occasionally they'll see a black-headed turkey vulture, perhaps flying with a kettle of adults, and think it's a black vulture. And it's strictly that black head that can confuse people.
It's just a juvenile.
Yeah, it's a juvenile bird. Up until adulthood, black head.
So if it is altricial, then it's just probably not going far from the nest?
No, it's fed. It's fed by its parents until fledging, and even after that, it will continue to be fed partially by its parents. But really, very early on, it will fly with a parent to a carrion, and will learn there at the kill site.
We know vultures typically consume carrion, and there are a number of unique features to this turkey vulture that help it carry out this task well. The first we might notice is the head, like you mentioned, the lack of feathers in adult turkey vultures. How does that help it?
So you can just imagine that if you've got a head full of feathers and you're sticking that head into the rotting cavity of a deer, that head is going to be covered with gunk. Yeah. And in the case of the feathers, it's going to become matted and breed further bacteria, and it could harm the health of the bird. Yeah. With the turkey vulture, there are a couple of things going on. First of all, it doesn't have the feathers, so there's nothing to get matted and to generate more bacteria. Yes. But also the bare head bakes, if you will, in the sun. So that dries out any of the bacterial matter from the carcass. It dries it. It's like a sun drying a raisin. And so that bare head keeps them much healthier.
Outside of the head, I know they have another method they use to fend off bacteria growth on their body. What is that?
They possess gut microbia. And so the carrion that nothing else will eat, the turkey vulture can consume, and those strong battery acid type chemicals will break that down without any harm to the bird. So the pathogens that occur in rotting flesh, that bacteria, that E. coli, that streptococcus, whatever it is ingested by the turkey vulture, and it's those strong stomach acids that break that down and don't harm the turkey vulture at all. This is why it is the purifier of the habitats, because it cleans all of the anthrax, for example. It cleans up, it can handle that kind of bacterial, microbial pathogen. So the turkey vulture is truly, it provides an enormous service to us and our species, as well as many other species.
Yeah. So we talked about how the head, we have no feathers, so it is able to protect it from bacteria there. Then with the quote-unquote battery acid, is able to purify whatever it consumes. Right. But then when we have this vulture and it lands on this deer carcass, it's right in it. How does it protect the rest of its body from bacteria that may form on other parts of its body?
Well, the turkey vulture is a raptor. It doesn't have strong talons that can rip apart the flesh. The beak is primarily for that, but it will land on that carcass and get its talons all gunked up. Yeah. Again, that's bacterial, pathological invasion, if you will, onto the turkey vulture's body. One of the interesting behaviors that turkey vultures do is they will urinate/defecate on their legs and feet. This is called urohydrosis. Okay. And basically what that does is further break down any harmful bacteria or pathogen on the legs of the turkey vulture. That urination defecation material also has strong antimicrobial properties. There's also thought and some degree of data to suggest that the urination on the legs also help cool, thermoregulate the turkey vulture through evaporation. Yeah. So that's an interesting behavior that they do.
Yes.
Oh, and let me just say one more thing about that, Chris, because it is interesting. When I was at the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory, there was some discussion about banding turkey vultures. Well, in fact, you really can't because of that urination. You wouldn't be able to, or defecation, you wouldn't be able to read the bands after a certain amount of time. So this is why you see condors, for example, with wing tags. If you want to band a vulture, the best way to do that is with a wing tag.
Okay. Just right in this little piece here, you mentioned that they didn't really have the ability to tear flesh. Is there something different about their beak that doesn't allow them to do that?
Yes, they have a hooked beak like a raptor, but it is fairly weak. And so it's not designed to tear apart or rip fresh flesh.
Okay.
It is designed to tackle the soft, rotting flesh of their carrion. And by the way, the term vulture, I mentioned the genus species name, the Latin name of the turkey vulture at the beginning, but the word vulture, we believe, comes from the Latin velere, V-E-L-L-E-R-E, which means to tear or to pluck.
Oh.
So that is what they're doing. They are plucking or tearing soft flesh from their rotted carrion.
Okay. So if you're trying to approach one of these birds for a better look, you might have a hard time if you're just listening to their call. Why is that?
Yes, you're right. The turkey vulture, along with the New World vultures, and I'm not sure, but I suspect this is true of the Old World vultures as well, they lack a syrinx. Oh, there's a desert spiny lizard. Just caught my eye. They lack a syrinx, which is that vocal apparatus that songbirds have that enable them to sing. So turkey vultures are really, you're not going to hear them calling in flight. They are relegated to hisses when they're approached or threatened, or grunts. They will grunt to their young or to each other, but no other vocalizations other than that because of the lack of syrinx.
So you might identify them by sight then?
Absolutely by sight. It's not uncommon to see a kettle of several vultures flying overhead. You may start to see vultures congregating on a carrion site. But interestingly, I'd like to share a little anecdote about vultures. They find their prey by sense of smell. They also have a good sense of sight, but there was some talk in the scientific community prior to the 50s about whether or not the vultures could find their food mainly by sight, mainly by smell, or a combination of both. So in the late 50s, an ornithologist named Kenneth Strager was approached by a man from Union Gas who said, we're noticing these turkey vultures congregating around a gas leak in our pipelines. So to back up a little bit, gas companies that have natural gas in their pipelines use an odorant called ethyl mercaptan.
Okay.
It has the smell, the chemical constituency of rotting flesh. And they were putting that in their pipelines to detect leaks.
Okay.
So when this Union Oil official approached Kenneth thought, wow, I wonder if they're attracted to that ethyl mercaptan. So he devised some sort of system, a machine that released this chemical down in, of all places, Puerto Peñasco or Rocky Point. So here regionally, it was discovered that yes, definitively, the turkey vulture finds its food by smell.
The turkey vulture has a keener sense of smell than some of these other vultures?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. It has a unique smell apparatus, and the navel cavity is perforated such that if you look from the side at a turkey vulture's beak, you can see right through it, directly through it. They have a very, very keen sense of smell. Those nostrils, if you will, are oval-shaped. And they allow, if you see the size of them, a tremendous amount of molecular information to enter their nasal cavity and then up into the brain.
So that's why they might be the first at the scene of a carcass before some of the other vultures.
Indeed. Turkey vultures, in fact, other vultures in our region, the black vulture and the California condor, will often follow turkey vultures to a carrion site. Now, interestingly, the turkey vulture is a very gentle bird. It looks fierce, but it's a very gentle bird. And in the pecking order of vulture species or carrion feeding species, the turkey vulture, while it finds the prey first, and hopefully it will get a good fill before caracaras, for example, or black vultures come in. The caracara is the most aggressive. So we'll get its fill first, and then the next in line will be the black vultures, and then the turkey vultures bring up the rear.
Okay. So they're, in effect, getting the scraps of the scraps, huh?
Well, hopefully they got a little bit before the other vultures discover, or the condor discover the kill site.
For this last question, I would like to touch on something we discussed before we started recording. I asked you about a subject that you were passionate about, and you mentioned a passion that was sparked by a book called Nature's Best Hope. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so being a general overall naturalist, I think in terms of the big picture, and I think in terms of what's happening with our planet and the changes we're going through with climate change and in our region, periods of drought. And it's always concerned me, going way back to the nene goose, because that was my first exposure to changes in biomes and what's happening with our bird species, plant species, what have you. So I've been following this for virtually my whole career, my vocation. And I just recently read a book by Douglas Tallamy called Nature's Best Hope. And this just dovetails so beautifully with my passion, which is how we can best preserve what we have on this planet. His approach is not unlike E.O. Wilson, who espouses an idea of half Earth, maintaining half of the Earth totally wild and human-free as the best way to combat what we're going through. And Tallamy's approach is very similar, but he calls it homegrown national park. And the idea is to take whatever you have, whether you live on a 300-acre ranch or a 2-acre homestead or a condominium or a patio home, whatever you have, to approach it like your own homegrown national park so that you plant species that are going to attract pollinators or birds. Don't plant something that's not native. Plant something that is of this region. It will be easier to care for. It will be easier to water because it will have, in most respects, habits that are more conducive to the environment in which it evolved. So that's my approach. I highly recommend this book. And I'm just very, very passionate about all of us doing what we can in even the smallest ways. If you have a balcony, you can put a pot out with Gooding's verbena or one of the small hummingbird attracting plants. There are a couple that you can find at, for example, Spadefoot Nursery here in town, and he's an excellent resource for native plants if you don't have a nursery that you like. So that's my approach. We're fortunate here in the desert in that we don't have vast stretches of lawns. Grassy lawns, which are so big in the Midwest. That's a monoculture. Very, very few things can survive in a monoculture. Think about those mile-long tracts of GMO, genetically modified corn in Nebraska. Those are monocultures. And it's that kind of thing that is inhibiting local native pollinators, bees, butterflies, moths, to either continue their migration in the case of a monarch or simply to lay their eggs, to oviposit and to breed a new generation. So yeah, that's my passion. I would just encourage all of your listeners to do whatever they can in getting native plants. One of the best things that you can do is plant a native oak. So in our region, that would be an emery oak or a Mexican blue oak at our elevation in Tucson here. And that one plant alone, that one tree alone, can support up to 200 species of different pollinators and butterflies, birds, moths. So yeah, I could go on and on about this because I'm passionate about it, but that's my thing right now. And I think I wanted to mention Tucson Audubon. They have a program called Habitat at Home, wherein they will help you establish your own homegrown national park. They don't call it that. That's Tallamy's version, but it's the same thing. They will help you establish. They will tell you what invasives you have that you maybe should remove. Fountain grass is a big one here because for many years the nursery sold it as a beautiful ornamental plant. And it is quite pretty, but it's not native. And it's crowding out a lot of our native species, especially in the washes, like Pima Canyon wash, Sabino Canyon wash. We now have fountain grass growing that's crowding out our native bear grass. So go on to the Tucson Audubon website, check out the Habitat at Home, and if you know nothing about plants, they will get you started and they will support you along the process.
All right. I noticed, as you mentioned, the different ideas for plants that could be placed in your living space, whether it's a massive living space and could accommodate an emery oak, or it's a smaller living space where you might just have a potted plant. You kept using the term pollinators, and can you tell us a little bit more about why it is so important for the plants we plant to bring in those pollinators?
So pollinators and pollination is one of the most important components of the web of life. It's the pollinators. I mean, if we didn't have pollinators, we would have no food. We would have no almonds. Our plants reproduce in the most part by pollination, either wind pollinated or by species of insects or birds that help them move that pollen from plant to fertilize that plant to grow a new generation of plants. If we lose our pollinators, we lose our plants. I don't think we want to do that.
No.
I think we're pretty reliant upon our plants. I mean, not just for food, but they provide us so much beauty. They provide us solace. Right now, they're providing us shade.
Sure.
They maintain proper soil composition. For other non-botanical specimens, the underground cicadas. So the pollinators are crucial to a healthy biome. And if we lose them, and we're beginning to lose them, insect populations, anecdotally, a lot of us old-timers probably remember driving down country roads and having a lot of splats of bugs on our windshields.
Sure.
Well, we don't see that so much anymore because we're losing a lot of our insects. And many, many of our insects are pollinators.
So then by planting one of these native plants, not only is it easier to maintain, not only does it attract local, wildlife per se, but you're also contributing to the greater community.
Absolutely. So if I have a homegrown national park and you're my neighbor, and you have a homegrown national park, and we convince the Joneses up the street to do the same thing, you're now providing a wildlife corridor so that larger species upon which the biome is dependent, they can also begin to flourish. So you'll see more browsers come through deer. Now, a lot of our deer will eat ornamental plants. They evolved to eat some of the native plants, but they're to be encouraged. And so the more biodiversity we have in general, the more habitat corridors or wildlife corridors that we have, the more we are encouraging biodiversity. And again, we're all one. It's all one planet.
Yeah.
And we are reliant upon each other, and we're reliant upon other species, just as other species are reliant upon us.
So even with a small potted plant in my backyard, I can contribute to this biodiversity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you have a patio space, you can plant an agave or some aloes. Aloes will bloom more or less every year. Now, that's not a native, but it is, again, back to convergent evolution. They evolved in South Africa in a very similar habitat. And so they behave very similarly to our cactus. But an agave, you can plant an agave in a pot. It will take many years perhaps for that agave to bloom.
Sure.
But once it does, you're attracting bats as pollinators. Bats pollinate agave, and without that, we don't have tequila. So we're really reliant upon our pollinators.
That's fair. Well, I'd like to thank Karen for joining us today. And I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow or subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening to this episode from. While you're there, I would appreciate it if you left a rating or review to help more people discover the podcast. You can visit lookingatbirds.com for show notes, a transcript of the episode, and pictures of the turkey vulture, along with some of the other birds that we mentioned today. Until next time, keep looking at birds.